He stood quietly at the back of the crowded hall, his presence barely noticed by the people around him. His clothes were worn, faded denim, a scuffed pair of boots, and a brown jacket that had clearly seen better days. The fabric near the cuffs was frayed, the collar drooping, and small holes dotted the sleeves. His beard was slightly unkempt, and the brim of his old cap cast a faint shadow over his eyes. He wasn't dressed like the others in their polished shoes, sleek suits, and elegant dresses. He didn't carry himself like someone used to being seen, and for that reason, most people didn't see him at all, at least, not the way they should have. A small group nearby noticed him and began whispering. One of them chuckled under his breath, nudging the woman beside him. "He walkin' off the street," he muttered, just loud enough for a few to hear. The woman glanced over her shoulder and smirked. Must have thought this was a shelter, not a medal ceremony. Another joined in with a laugh, casting a quick glance before returning to his conversation about golf and vacation plans. The man in ragged clothes heard them. Of course he did. But he didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even lift his head. The whispers grew into low murmurs. Someone from the front row turned around and frowned at the sight of him. A security volunteer began to walk his way, unsure whether he belonged. "Sir, this is a private event," she began, but the man simply nodded and held up a lanyard from his pocket, a folded invitation barely visible behind it. She paused, scanned it, and gave a reluctant nod before walking off. Even as the ceremony began, the quiet judgment didn't stop. People stole glances. Some sneered. Others laughed silently to themselves. It wasn't just his clothes, it was the contrast. The contrast between him and the spotless perfection of the event, the shimmering uniforms of decorated officers, the shining medallions, and the glossy programs handed out at the door. He didn't fit the picture. He wasn't part of the image they'd carefully crafted for this day. A young man in uniform sitting with his family leaned in toward his father. "Why would they let someone like that in here?" he asked with a puzzled tone. The father looked, frowned slightly, and replied, "Probably one of those forgotten vets." Sad, but it's no excuse for looking like that. That sentence hung in the air, unchallenged by anyone nearby. The man remained still. Occasionally, he'd glance around, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet understanding, like he'd seen this before. Many times. Maybe in airports. On sidewalks. In waiting rooms where no one spoke. In offices where they only looked at paperwork and never his eyes. He carried the weight of those moments in his shoulders, and it showed in the way he stood, calm but weary. To those in the room, he was invisible until he wasn't. He was irrelevant until he became unavoidable. But in that moment, during those early minutes of the event, all they saw was his appearance. All they chose to judge was his clothing, his posture, his silence. They didn't know what was sewn into the lining of that old jacket. They didn't know what those scuffed boots had walked through. They didn't know what kind of stories lived behind those weathered eyes. They only saw what they wanted to see, a man who didn't belong. The hall was filled with a soft murmur of conversation, the kind that swells just before a formal event begins. Elegant men and women, adorned with medals, ties, and perfectly tailored uniforms, mingled with each other, exchanging polite greetings and rehearsed smiles. In the midst of this polished crowd, the man in ragged clothes remained an island of silence. He stood with his hands gently clasped, head slightly lowered, as if trying not to be noticed, but his presence did the opposite. His faded clothing and worn-out boots stood out like a stain against the spotless backdrop. People noticed. They always did. But instead of curiosity or kindness, what came first was the quiet ripple of mockery. A young woman in a sleek navy blue blazer leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Do you think he's lost or something?" Her friend stifled a giggle, trying not to make eye contact with the man. "Looks like someone forgot to change after sleeping on a bench," she replied, with a sideways smirk. They both laughed, their voices low but unmistakably sharp. Another man standing near the punch table glanced over his shoulder at the figure in the back, rolled his eyes, and muttered, "Guess anyone can walk in these days." What started as private jokes spread like a subtle contagion. The whispers floated across the room like smoke, curling around groups of attendees, feeding an unspoken consensus that the man didn't belong. Even those who said nothing couldn't help but exchange glances and shake their heads slightly. Some offered uncomfortable half-smiles as they walked past him, as if silently apologizing for their own discomfort. Others didn't even hide their disdain. Two young officers near the center row leaned in, one nudging the other with a nod toward the man. "Bet you $10 he smells like gasoline," one said under his breath. The other chuckled, adding, "Nah, he's probably just trying to get a free meal out of this." Their laughter was short but cruel, and neither gave a second thought to the depth of their words. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was the casual cruelty that comes from people who've never had to wonder what it's like to be invisible. Nearby, a woman with a clipboard, likely part of the organizing committee, shot a concerned glance toward the back of the hall. She whispered something to a fellow organizer, who looked back briefly and raised an eyebrow. "He's on the list?" she asked. The woman shrugged. "Supposedly. But still, maybe ask him to wait outside." No one acted on it yet, but the suspicion lingered. Even as the lights dimmed slightly and the announcer walked toward the microphone, the whispers did not die down completely. They simply evolved into sharp side-eyes, stiffened backs, and hushed remarks passed behind palms. Every time someone looked his way, it was through a lens of assumption about who he was, what he'd done, and why he looked like he did. Not a single person questioned their own reaction. They didn't ask themselves why someone dressed so plainly might be there. They didn't wonder if there was a story behind the threadbare coat or the faded insignia stitched quietly onto his sleeve. No one considered that perhaps he wasn't lost at all, that maybe he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Instead, they chose laughter. They chose whispers. They chose to perform their judgment in a room meant to honor dignity, service, and sacrifice. All their smiles and medals didn't mask the truth of what was happening. They were mocking someone they didn't know, simply because he didn't meet their visual expectations. The man in ragged clothes stayed quiet through it all, unmoving, unbothered on the surface, yet surrounded by a cloud of murmurs that pressed closer with every passing second. The ceremony had just begun. The lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over the neatly arranged chairs and polished podium. A tall Marine colonel, decorated and poised, approached the microphone with practiced authority. His uniform was crisp, buttons gleaming under the warm overhead lights, and his presence commanded attention. The chatter faded to respectful silence as he looked out over the crowd. Rows of polished shoes, pressed collars, and proud faces stared back at him. He began to speak, his voice deep and measured. His opening remarks touched on tradition, honor, and the weight of service. He named individuals being recognized that day, some retired, some posthumously honored. The audience nodded, clapped, and murmured their appreciation. Cameras flashed discreetly from the back corners of the hall. But the colonel's tone was not just ceremonial. There was something in the way he scanned the crowd, something unsettled just beneath his otherwise composed expression. As he reached a section of the speech where he began to recount past missions and honor code names used during critical operations, his eyes briefly swept over the audience again. Then, suddenly, his voice caught, just a fraction of a second. Barely perceptible, but noticeable enough to shift the energy in the room. He blinked, looked again. Somewhere near the back of the room, his gaze locked on the man in ragged clothes. The man had remained still, head lowered slightly, as he had for the last 30 minutes. But now there was a shift. Not in him, but in the colonel. The colonel's hand, resting casually on the edge of the podium, gripped it tighter. His posture straightened more than military discipline demanded. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, like a ghost from a battlefield returning without warning. The words on his script no longer mattered. The pages in front of him might as well have disappeared. The audience noticed, subtly at first. A few exchanged glances, unsure what had interrupted the flow. The colonel stood still, staring, mouth slightly open, the rhythm of the ceremony unraveling in real time. The silence hung there, thick and confusing, as he took one slow step back from the microphone. Another heartbeat passed. Then two. No one spoke. No one moved. He was a man used to order, used to protocol, used to things making sense. But there was something about that figure in the back, something about the quiet man with the battered coat and worn boots that shook the room's sense of certainty. The colonel's eyes didn't look away. He wasn't staring at the clothes. He wasn't looking at the man's posture or judging the appearance. He was remembering. He saw something no one else in that room could see. Not yet. Not in that moment. But he saw it clearly. And whatever it was pulled him out of his rehearsed speech, out of the ceremony, out of the formal performance everyone expected. A nervous cough came from the second row. A woman near the front shifted in her chair, glancing behind her, trying to follow the colonel's gaze. But he didn't move. His chest rose and fell more heavily now, the room's silence amplifying the faintest of sounds. Then, without a word, he stepped forward again. He didn't reach for his notes. He didn't clear his throat or make a joke to break the tension. He simply looked into the distance as if time had rolled back, as if he was no longer standing in a decorated hall, but somewhere far, far away. And in that moment, everyone in the room felt the atmosphere change. Not by volume, not by movement, but by the sheer weight of the colonel's sudden stillness. Something had shifted. Something deep. A hush settled over the room like a thick fog. Eyes darted between the Marine colonel and the ragged man standing quietly at the back. The colonel's stare had grown fixed, intense, not aggressive, but loaded with something no one else could fully read. Confusion washed across the faces of the guests. Some craned their necks to see who had caught the colonel's attention. Others whispered questions that went unanswered. The ceremony that had been so carefully structured now felt like it was teetering on the edge of something no one expected. The colonel slowly stepped away from the podium. His boots struck the floor with a measured pace, echoing faintly in the stunned silence. Each step was deliberate. He walked not as if approaching a stranger, but as if confronting a memory. Every eye in the room followed his movements, the tension thick enough to stifle breath. He didn't stop until he was just a few feet away from the man in ragged clothes. For a long moment, neither spoke. The colonel stood tall, eyes searching the face in front of him, and the man in the coat finally lifted his gaze to meet them. What passed between them was invisible to the rest of the crowd, but undeniable. The colonel's expression shifted, just slightly. His jaw tightened. His brows furrowed. Then slowly, his lips parted and he spoke, not loudly, not for the room, but directly to the man. Code name, Phantom Echo. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Those nearby exchanged confused looks, while others whispered, "Did he say?" Phantom Echo. The name meant little to most in attendance, but not to everyone. A few veterans in the room went still, their expressions morphing from casual interest to stunned disbelief. One of them leaned forward, whispering to his neighbor, "That can't be right." Phantom Echo was just a rumor. A myth. But the colonel didn't flinch. His voice had cracked slightly when he spoke the name, and now his eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with gravity. A silent reverence. The ragged man remained unmoved, but his shoulders lifted, just barely, as if acknowledging the identity that had been spoken aloud after so many years in silence. The colonel straightened further, as if remembering the weight of honor, of command. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he raised his hand to his brow and gave a full, precise salute. There was no music, no announcer, no prompt. Just the unmistakable sound of boots coming together, of a soldier paying respect. Mouths dropped open. Phones that had been used moments earlier to snap photos of awards and smiles were now frozen in uncertain hands. People looked at one another, seeking explanations that wouldn't come. A general seated in the front row narrowed his eyes, recognizing something that had long been buried in classified files. A woman in a white dress, mid-sentence to her husband, paused as the weight of the gesture settled in. No one knew what to do. A man they had all dismissed only minutes earlier was now standing in the presence of a colonel's salute, something reserved only for equals, for legends, for the unseen heroes of wars too complicated to explain on stage. For many in the room, the name Phantom Echo might as well have been a ghost story. A code whispered in intelligence briefings. A silhouette spoken of only behind closed doors. He was the kind of operative you heard about but never met. The kind who vanished without parades or medals, who worked in shadows and lived without recognition. And now he was here, in this room, in ragged clothes. A stillness fell over the hall that no speech could recover from. The colonel's salute lingered in the air, a gesture so deliberate, so powerful, that the room seemed to forget how to breathe. The man in ragged clothes didn't return it immediately. He simply stood there, eyes meeting the colonel's with the calm, practiced stillness of someone who'd been here before, in a different way, under different skies, in moments where silence was louder than bombs. His body language didn't scream pride. It didn't scream shame. It said something quieter, deeper, and understanding. And then, after a few long, heavy seconds, the man responded. He didn't raise his hand to salute in return, not like protocol might demand. Instead, he gave a slight nod, the kind soldiers use in the field, small, efficient, and soaked in mutual respect. That single gesture was enough. The colonel held his salute for another beat before lowering his hand, eyes still locked onto the man. He took a step back, not out of deference, but acknowledgement. As if silently admitting, this man had earned something that went beyond formalities. The crowd began to stir again, the silence breaking apart slowly like a glacier cracking under heat. Whispers returned, but they were no longer mocking. No one was laughing now. Eyes that had once looked at the ragged man with judgment now studied him with a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. A shift had happened, and it had changed everything. The energy in the room was no longer focused on the ceremony or the honored guests at the front. It was anchored to the back, to the place where the forgotten man now stood, no longer forgotten. A young officer near the middle of the hall stood up. His face had gone pale. He whispered something to his superior, who immediately turned around to get a better view. "Is that really him?" someone muttered. "Is that Phantom Echo?" Others began to rise to their feet, not out of obligation, but instinct. Slowly, hesitantly at first, and then more decisively, people began standing. One row at a time, as if pulled by an unseen gravity. But no one approached. They didn't need to. The distance was part of the reverence. From afar, he seemed taller now, though he hadn't moved. He seemed larger, though his frame was still slight, his shoulders still wrapped in that worn coat. What had changed was the room's vision. They were no longer seeing a man in old clothes. They were seeing what those clothes had been through. Some recognized the name from blacked-out files they were never supposed to read. Others remembered hearing about the missions, covert operations where entire teams went dark and only one operative came back. Missions where governments offered no comment and medals were never handed out because the paperwork didn't officially exist. He was one of those shadows, one of those legends that drifted through briefing rooms and whispered rumors, but never made the news. And now he was here, among them, silent, still, and real. An elderly veteran near the side wall placed a hand over his heart. Not in performance, not for show, but in quiet honor. A woman in dress blues wiped her eyes with her gloved fingers, not sure why the moment hit her so hard. It wasn't the salute that undid her. It was what it represented. That behind the jokes and judgment, behind the worn jacket and muddy boots, was a life she could never fully understand. A service that went unspoken for decades. A cost none of them had paid, but all of them now felt. It didn't take long for the realization to ripple across the room. quietly shattering the earlier judgments like glass beneath a steady hand. People who had laughed under their breath were now staring, frozen in place, faces slack with disbelief. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic music, just a heavy shift in the air. The man they had dismissed had become the center of everything, not because he demanded it, but because it could no longer be denied. He hadn't uttered a single word, but the colonel's reaction had spoken louder than any introduction could. A Marine colonel, respected, decorated, unshakable, had not only recognized him, but honored him publicly with a salute. That gesture alone had burned through the crowd's assumptions. It was a declaration that this wasn't just some vagrant who had wandered into a military ceremony. This man, ragged as he appeared, had a history so profound, so classified, so deeply respected, that the colonel's voice had cracked at the mere mention of his code name. And that's when the crowd began to truly see him, not just look, but see. They saw the stillness in his body, not his stiffness, but discipline. The way his eyes moved, slow and deliberate, like a man trained to scan every environment, even while standing still. They saw the boots, scuffed and worn, and realized they weren't signs of poverty, but evidence of distance, of terrain crossed, of places where no cameras had ever been allowed. They noticed the patch, just barely visible beneath his coat, faded, nearly colorless, but unmistakably authentic. The silence in the room was no longer uncomfortable. It was reverent. Some people looked away in guilt, their earlier comments now echoing loudly in their own minds. They remembered every word they had said about his clothes, his appearance, his place in the room. Others looked on with wide eyes, as if seeing a ghost come to life. A man whose name was likely buried under decades of black ink and red stamps. A man who had probably received orders on scraps of paper and disappeared for years at a time. A man who carried not just the weight of his own past, but the silence of missions that would never be acknowledged. A child sitting in the back tugged on his father's sleeve. "Why did that man salute him?" he whispered. The father didn't answer right away. He just stared at the ragged figure, realizing he didn't have the words. Not yet. Because how do you explain to a child that real heroes don't always wear medals or uniforms or smiles? That sometimes they come home with scars too deep for skin, wearing coats they've had for decades, walking into rooms where no one claps for them until someone finally remembers. More guests began to rise to their feet. This time not out of confusion or formality, but respect. It wasn't organized. No one directed them. It was instinctual, the human response to witnessing something pure and undeniable. A legend in plain sight. A truth that didn't need embellishment. Photographers lowered their cameras. The speeches planned for later were forgotten. All attention remained locked on the man whose presence had appended the very rhythm of the event. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything they had assumed had been undone in a single moment. Their mocking glances, their casual cruelty, all of it erased by the weight of one man's quiet dignity. A man who hadn't asked to be seen, but who could no longer be unseen.